Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if you are on that part of the world. We will just wait for everybody to get in and settle in, but thank you all for joining us. Joint webinar today with Squalify and Horváth. We will be talking about cyber risk under DORA and NIS2. It is a very, very hot day here in Munich, so I hope that you are having great weather wherever in the world you are joining us from. As I say, we'll give it a second just for people to arrive, and then we will get straight into it. Oh, down, a couple more. I will give it a few more seconds until the clock on my computer ticks over to the next minute and then make it start. So should be nearly there. There we go. Cool. Let's make a start. Thank you all for joining us promptly. We will very grateful for you all joining us on this very hot summer afternoon in July, joining us to talk about cyber risk with DORA and NIS2. So, what are we going to talk about this afternoon? We're going to quickly introduce ourselves shortly, but then we're going to really focus on the role of the board in the context of these regulations and how this is changing, how it is putting more responsibility directly onto the board now to manage cyber risk. We're going to be talking about a framework for managing those risks and how can we do that effectively? How do you set up the processes? How do you understand the people and the roles and responsibilities involved? And then we're going to talk in particular about cyber risk and how we make that ready for the board, introducing the Squalify platform, and we're going to give you a demo of that so you can really see not just some slideware, but also how are we doing that in practice? How can we use that to provide some messaging in a board-ready way, which puts quantification for cyber risk front and center, but helps explain what those numbers mean. We'll summarize it up at the end, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. If you do have questions as we're going through slides, please use the chat function in Teams or the Q&A function in Teams. We will keep an eye on that and call out any questions and answers. We might not do it straight away depending on the flow, but we will certainly make sure every question is answered and do our best to fill you in. Cool. Let me then introduce myself and my partners here for the webinar. So my name is Douglas Needham. I'm here on the right in this slide. I run our consulting team here at Squalify, so making sure that our customers get the best out of our platform, helping them with messaging, helping them understand how we quantify cyber risk. My background is 15 years of various different information security and cybersecurity roles, most recently culminating in leading security teams in Allianz Insurance, for example, and at Klarna, the fintech. But since the last year and a half, I have been here at Squalify, and I will hand you over to Dennis and Kai from Horváth to introduce themselves.
So hello everybody, my name is Dennis. I'm principal at Horváth, and I'm having 10 years experience in the field of risk management, information security management, but also the field of identity and access management. And I support clients around the world in various industries in implementing an ISMS, but also establishing IT risk management frameworks, always focusing on effectiveness and also on the other hand on regulatory compliance. So that means as such I deal extensively with regulations, current regulations such as NIS2 or DORA, but I'm also dealing with international standards in cybersecurity or information security like NIST, like ISO 27000 or German standards like Basic Grundschutz. And I hand over to you, Kai.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, also from my side. My name is Kai. I'm with Horváth for nearly 4 years now. Do have a Big Four consultancy background as well, and leading the risk and analytics department at Horváth, focusing on digitizing and automating governance, risk, and compliance functions, and also trying to connect all of the functions from the methodology side. So really focusing on the G of the GRC, but also setting up, for example, risk management systems, internal controls, but also working closely with Dennis and the team on cybersecurity and how to integrate it and how to make it actually visible and useful to board and C-level. And how that will look like, we'll show you also in a minute. But for now, I'll hand back to Douglas to break the ice.
Thank you very much. Yes, and a nice handover there. So as I think we've kind of covered with both of the introductions here, this is a joint webinar between Horváth and Squalify. I think having both introduced ourselves, you've got a feel for how this works, and you can see a bit more detail how we go through that in a second. But this is not just about breaking the ice and not just about us. It's hopefully should be a very interactive session now. So thanks, Nick. Our moderator has introduced a question now. This is to get you active, thinking, trying to put in perspective how your current handling of DORA and NIS2 is going. And as it is a very hot day, we're talking summer drinks. Have a little bit of flexibility with the interpretations here, but we're trying to get a feel for, are you super prepared for DORA and NIS2? Is it something that is running late and you've thought about it but not doing too much? Totally under control? You had this handled for ages and this is totally easy. We're already covered with this, or out of the loop. So hopefully you should have had a kind of question box pop up in Teams. If you can pick an answer for that, then we can get a feel for how everybody is doing, and you can see how everyone around the table is prepared for this. So I've just clicked through. So once you click through, you should see the results, I think. And it looks like there is a mix of barely affected. So that seems to be the highest one. So that's a good position. Glad to hear that that's under control. A mix of tap water there. Honestly, I wasn't even invited. I'll interpret that to say either not invited or perhaps not applicable for you, but hopefully that's there. But still quite a few people wired, stressed, drinking the espresso martinis there. So
something that does not look right.
Is somebody asking a question, or is that just background noise? If possible, Nicholas, can you mute the background noise? Thank you. Cool. So starting to think about it, hopefully you get a feel that whichever one of these categories you're in, you're not alone, and that you are very much among people who are also going through this together. So warm up done, let's get into the details. So the role of the board in managing cyber risk. And this is where I will now hold over to my colleagues from Horváth to introduce the topic.
Yeah, let's dive into the topic, the board's role in cybersecurity, also in the context of NIS2 and DORA. And in order to understand the strategic priorities of CISOs or board of directors, we at Horváth, we annually survey or question over or talk to over 700 CISOs, CX level executives, in order to understand what they are driving, what kind of topics they are dealing with. And then the latest findings, we've brought them here, and the 2025 study will be coming out soon, showed that cybersecurity is constantly ranked among the top 3 priorities of companies, alongside with digital transformation, which is connected also a little bit to the cybersecurity topic, but also the topic of profitability improvement. And why is the topic of cybersecurity actually so important? So first of all, we have rising digitalization, and this is expanding the attack surface of organization due to more and more infrastructure, IT infrastructure is coming in, and it's becoming more complex. And successful cyber attacks, as we all know, can cause a massive operational, but also financial and last but not least, but also reputational damage, which basically can harm or hurt the business. And on the other hand, we see also technological changes that introduces new threats to the organization. We see a lot of shadow IT out there, which is unmanaged. We see AI, which is coming up, and organizations do not know how to deal with it in the context of security. Cloud infrastructure is another topic that drives those changes and causes new threats. And yeah, we are talking about DORA and we're talking about NIS2. So obviously, as at least some of you feel, regulatory pressure is also increasing. On EU level, but for many countries also on a local level. And taking those things together, and this is probably common sense, we know cybersecurity is not an IT isolated issue. It's a business critical strategy or business critical priority for organization. And that means, and that's what we take here as a key message as a board, since it is a strategic topic. As a board, it's really important to understand it, to manage it, but also to embed the topic of cybersecurity into the business strategy and into business goals, because those things are really interconnected. And if we jump on the next slide, we see, for example, when we look on DORA, like the regulation in context of cybersecurity for the financial sector in the EU, but when we also look on NIS2, which is a more principle-based regulation, but for organization and critical infrastructure sectors within the EU, then we see, and both of them basically require a mandate that cyber risk are managed systematically. And both of those regulations also state and hold executive leadership accountable for that topic. So that means both regulations emphasize that there needs to be a clear responsibility of executive leadership in managing risks in general, in controlling risks, but especially also here in cyber risk for cyber risks. And it's about implementing effective cyber risk management or ICT risk management frameworks, and the responsibility lies within the executive board. And this is probably, and we will talk about it a little bit later, one also very crucial thing, it requests or it asks for active engagement of board members in cyber risk discussion and in the involvement of strategic decision regarding the dealing with cyber risk. Means leadership need to understand strategic relevance of the topic of cyber risk and also the importance of cyber hygiene. So in short, executive management is directly responsible for cyber risk management. And when we go to the next slide, we also see that the strategic importance of cyber risks, but also the evolving, I've been talking about the evolving regulatory pressure, have been shaping the role of boards in cybersecurity over the last years. So it's not as I mentioned, an IT topic anymore, it's a strategic topic, and we have probably a common sense about this. So when we look on the role of the board in the topic, we can say, first of all, from our perspective, the boards must set the tone, so and shape the culture of risk awareness and also of accountability in terms of risks. And on the other hand, it's also, and I mentioned it a little bit before, the board has to understand the connection between cyber risk, cyber security, and also the business goals. So cybersecurity affects the business goal and efforts to basically for security need to be aligned in the context of business. Needs to oversee the risk exposure to make strategic decisions. It's about providing resources and investments in order to safeguard basically the business from an IT and a security perspective. And the most important thing from our perspective is constantly review, challenging the topic of cyber risk management, the risk management processes, the security processes. But what we see on the other hand is that there is a gap between the awareness that we have also shown in our study and the action out there. So in line with also our study, we can say that most board members recognize cybersecurity as business critical, but less than 50% are actually involved in the topic. So it's a gap, and like an engagement gap between, on the one hand, the understanding, on the other hand, the action. So when we jump one slide further, we can reflect about it. What are typically questions that the board should ask, or that the boards should ask, and on the other hand, what should you as CISOs or as part of the security team be ready to answer? When you look at the question, they're basically fairly simple on the first side. So it's about what would a successful cybersecurity event or attack cost the company? How are we prepared for the worst case? It's about what are the top risks, the biggest cyber risks out there? How are we mitigating them? Or it's questions about are we investing enough money in order to be secure? How secure are we? Are we spending too less, too much? On which security processes are effective, which are not? As I mentioned, fairly simple questions, but many teams lack the ability to provide clear and consistent answers on those fairly simple questions. And this is, why is that the case? We can jump to the next slide. Why is that the case? So cybersecurity is a very complex topic. There are studies out there, for example, this one, that is one of the hardest topics to oversee for the board. And this is because either the board lacks information concerning cyber risks, or that not the board, either the security team or the organization itself lacks information concerning cyber risks, concerning measures, concerning risk exposures, or this information that they have is not consistent, it's not measured properly, it's not available at all. On the other hand, it can also be the case that the answers that are given from the security teams to the board are not really understood by the board, because we have a lack of expertise on it, or the reporting is not addressed on, or not suitable for board level. So it's we have communication gaps out there. Or C, the last point maybe, we have so-called blurred lines of accountability. That means it's not clear who is responsible for actually giving those answers, for collecting the information, for making the decision. And so in order to overcome those challenges from our side, it's really important to have a proper framework in place to deal with those strategic relevant cyber risks in the organization. And the principle that is underlying there, that is something that will Kai introduce you now on the next slides.
Yeah, so how do we actually connect all of the mentioned targets, different goals from coming operational side, but also coming really over tactical to strategical goals? So the board has its own goals. Each board member has different goals. And what we at Horváth promote here is being business confident. So business confidence really means that you do have more than just transparency about your governance functions, so that you know actually more than just your cyber risks. So you know that you have some cyber risks. This means like you have a transparent overview. But this is, from our opinion, not enough. You would like to know more. You want to actually connect your operational KPIs with also tactical and strategical goals and KPIs. And that means that you have to include more data and get a broader view of your whole company. So you start, as most of you most likely already do, you implement a cybersecurity or ISMS function to actually cover, identify, assess, start assessing cyber risks, and then you would like to do it better. You want to have a better evaluation of the risks that actually matter to your company. And to do that, we'll also show you now, let's say, if the fundamentals of how you can do it and what the framework components should look like. And we'll also show you in a second what's kind of from our perspective, the ultimate goal for all of the C-levels, to get a nice overview and a correct estimation of the risk landscape.
So as Kai mentioned, at the end, it's important to have a management system up and running that is basically providing the information and also providing the structure that is relevant to, as we say, steer or manage risks effectively. And when we talk about cybersecurity or cyber risks, there are frameworks out there that give a clear structure to the topic. And we brought in some elements here on the left-hand side, but we also brought with us some fundamentals that need to be implemented alongside these elements or this alongside these elements which you see on the left-hand side. So it's important on the one hand to have a clear and well-structured governance with defined roles, responsibility, but also accountability. Typically, RACI metrics is the term here that people talk about. It's important to have a systematic identification process in terms of critical processes, business processes, assets, but also then deriving cyber risks. And at the end, we really focus on taking those information on implementing preventive measures, to really improve your resilience on the one hand, but also to reduce the cyber risk on the other hand, like IAM, like training, like patch management, and so on and so forth. And in case of emergency, it's really important to focus on detecting capabilities, to identify attacks and incidents, such typically we use CM SOC teams there, but it's also important to think about recovery plan, response plans for a case of emergency. And this process, which is I think quite standard within the industries, this should be supported by, as we call it, fundamentals in order to steer those risks. So along this process, it's important to have a clear defined risk appetite. It's important to have a risk strategy, cyber risk strategy that is aligned with the business objects. You have to take care of your risk registers, and you have to set up clear reporting. We bring along a KPI templates and KPI structures that are important to constantly monitor your security processes in order to identify gaps and identify investment opportunity. When it's about investing in cybersecurity, it's important to think of the return on investment. So where does it make sense most to invest, and where does it make not so much sense because the money is not really reducing risk? And it's also about having a control testing approach, thinking of simulations, thinking of continuous improvement, and also monitor it. And at the heart of this, I would say, rather broad framework lies a structured cyber risk and mitigation process. And this process we see on the next slide is something that really also takes Squalify up, because this process, and we will see it, is also something that is perfectly fits into the Squalify approach. At the end, first of all, it's important to identify potential threats. So to the organization, to the processes, we assess vulnerabilities within the process, within those assets, in order to understand attack vectors based on audits, based on technical testing, or findings from the auditor, or findings from the external auditors. And it's also about looking into the internal control system in order to identify weak spots. Then we do a systematic risk evaluation in order to, based on the threat and the vulnerability, to identify the significant risks. And here also the risk appetite plays a crucial role, because you do not want to have all risks that you identify in the risk registers, but rather have a list of the top 30, 40, depending on the size, risks that you really want to focus as a board or as also CISOs. And based on that, you derive action plans. Think of the fundamental. That means we are not just deriving action plans, but really think of what makes sense most. We're implementing those measures risk-based in order to maximize the risk reduction. and this is all integrated into a systematic monitoring process. And I think the most important thing is, and this is something many companies do not follow, this is a periodic, even an ongoing cyclical process. So it's about ongoing monitoring. It's about evaluation of the measures, thinking of and trying to find out if the non-conformities or the vulnerabilities that I identified have been reduced. If they have been reduced, it was effective. Sometimes, and that's what we see out there, that measures are not really effective because they do not have a real impact on the vulnerabilities. So in summary, from that risk management process part, business confidence in cybersecurity really depends on embedding cyber risk management processes, risk identification processes into the organization's overall GRC framework. And this is something Kai will also give you a quick look at it.
Yeah. And also what Dennis mentioned, having it as an ongoing activity. When talking about ongoing, you always also talk about real-time, real-life data. So what we brought to you today is also a little outlook. So on the next slide, you will see our business confidence dashboard, which actually shows a combination of, first of all, of the governance functions all in one place, all connected. But what we mentioned before, it's also targeting the C-level. So whenever you think about your top KPIs, you usually want to see them first, of course. Yeah, so what we can do here is integrate performance data from your finance department, for example, but also additional KPIs like customer satisfaction or employee satisfaction scores. And all of those are somehow connected to different kind of risks. And of course, cybersecurity or cyber risk do play a prominent role. We know it from surveys. We also know it from our day-to-day business. You do have incidents, which is fine, but it's always about knowing what's the consequence of it. How, or am I still capable of reaching my goals? So how does a risk, in case it actually materializes, how does it change our target? Can we still reach it? Is it out of reach now? Is it maybe just located in a dedicated process, or is it linked to a dedicated asset, for example? So talking about cyber, for example, if you do have your data storage in your building, then of course, especially in those hot days, the AC system, cooling system is crucial. So you have to think about what happens if this system actually gets manipulated. Maybe it produces more heat, so that means it actually needed more cooling, but somehow you do not have the right measures in place. This is something we would like to avoid. So connecting all of the different kind of risks, also how they would kind of work together. Maybe you have some cyber attack, but also some heat at the same time, and they, of course, can have dramatic consequences to your company, and most likely, or sometimes you just fail to reach your goals. So this as an outlook, of course, you can also integrate new technologies like AI. You can connect it with your central library, measure library, but also, for example, internal control systems. Do you have the right controls in place? Or some other systems like the identity access management. Is it in place and running? And when talking about is it actually in place and running, you always can see like those well-known colors, the traffic light. So is it red, yellow, or green? And to actually evaluate if it's red, yellow, or green, you of course need the data. And with Squalify, you actually have the chance to get data, real data, and actually you have the possibility to really calculate cyber risks and how that should or could be done. Doug will show you now in the next minutes.
Thank you, Kai. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dennis. And thank you for people asking questions in the chat. Do keep them coming. We'll answer them in the Q&A section at the end. Or if you'd rather ask your question out loud, there'll be opportunity to do that as well. Great. So let me bring you into the next section here. So Squalify is very much focused on quantifying cyber risk. Our software as a service and our methodology is here to put a real euros, pounds, dollars figure on cyber risk. And there are many other vendors in the market, and there's typically two ways to do this. One is looking at across the whole company from what we call the top down. This is looking at broad company enterprise level risks, worst case scenarios, looking at how does this really impact the company as a whole. And then there's a bottom-up way of doing it where you might start with an individual asset, a system, and look at, typically this is a more technical approach. So just to sort of prime you to the way that we're looking at this now, we are looking enterprise-wide, we're looking top-down, and these are the kind of questions that we spoke about earlier that a board is interested in. It's what are the kind of events that will really disrupt the resilience of the company, that will cost us the most as the company. These are the big things that boards are typically asked to think about and look at. Less so we're not conformant with this particular thing, what's the risk? These things tend to be aggregated together to give a bigger overall company view. And how do we do this? And what does this help with the board? One of the things, first question is often asked is, well, how much is it going to cost us? This is where a red, amber, green type approach typically gets into difficulties. Now you can say, oh, but we use ranges here. We know that very high is over $1 million or however you call it. But sometimes that highest bucket is open-ended, and the difference between something that might cause an impact of 1 million versus 100 million is sometimes disguised. So having a little bit more precision there can be helpful. Having a methodology for quantifying your risk also now helps you to simulate what the effects of improvements are, because you can reduce that number and you can very easily then calculate your return on security investment. I'm going to show you how we do this in a short while. And there are a number of use cases that these kind of two powerful things help with. So yes, this helps with communicating with the board, helping the board understand. It helps with cyber insurance. So if you know how much your worst case incidents might cost, you can better understand your transfer needs. And of course, this comes with not just one company, but you can look across your supply chain. You can use this on an ongoing basis to look across the company and how risks are progressing over time. And indeed, perhaps you want to do it if you are in a large group. There may be different sizes of risks in different entities. And of course, question the board always wants to know is, how do we compare with competitors? And this kind of approach helps with benchmarking as well. We in Squalify use 3 categories of data to quantify this risk. And this is very simplified approach. This is an approach that is inherited from our parent company, Munich Re, which is a large insurance company. Typically, an insurance company will not have access to individual super granular data, and so they have to make risk assessments from higher level data. So we take data about the company as a whole, the revenue, the industry, how many employees have they got. We then focus that in on what are the scenarios specific to this firm. And this might be useful in the context of something like DORA, where it's important to understand what are the critical important functions which you really need to understand and make sure are resilient. That's normally a good starting point for understanding those scenarios. Of course, we feed in as well security maturity data to understand how you're doing at the moment. This feeds into our platform. We have a quantification model that has been used and refined over a decade, accompanied by a whole load of historic loss data. And of course, we have the Monte Carlo simulation here. This then takes care of all the maths, all of the difficult data gathering, leaving you to focus on the items most specific to your organization. And of course, it's all in a platform, so you don't need to deal with loads of spreadsheets and make loads of guesses. What does that all look like? Let me show you now. Just give me a moment while I swap my windows from PowerPoint. I will start at the end here. So somebody is using their AI thing. Which window is it? Is this one? This one. Cool. So here is the Squalify platform, and those three categories that I've just spoken about are covered in three input fields here. So company information, typically very simple to look at. This is our kind of demo customer, if you like, a banking financial group. Very simple questions to answer. What region are they in? What is the revenue? How many employees do they have? How many records do they have? And then this feeds into the quantification approach. We have the second main input category here, input scenarios, what we call consequence scenarios. So we focus what happens in a cyber event, and what will that then lead to for the company. This then means, what do you have to pay for in the event of these kind of things? So for example, for a data privacy breach, it's important to know which part of the world is this data privacy breach happening in, because that drives things like regulatory investigations, regulatory fines. It drives questions about class action lawsuits, those kind of things. We ask a set of very simple questions around number of records, how sensitive are those records, what are the categories of personal records here. And then one of the biggest drivers for these kind of things is around legal fees. So this then starts to ask questions about, do you have legal retainers for data protection incidents, and do you have costs within these which are well known? And if you don't, we can make suggestions here based on other data and so on. So a set of simple questions for each scenario. And then finally, for information security, we have as our default set of information security framework, we use the NIST cybersecurity framework. So you would go through, assess the maturity against each of these. If you use other frameworks, such as ISO 27001, we can do mappings with that, and that all goes ahead straightforward. So that's the input side. I can show you as well, what does that look like, and what are you going to show the board? Because I think this is then the important question that what we're all here for. We're talking about the board today. And that is this window. Cool. So this is our reporting template, if you like to call it that. So this pulls out the results of the quantifications, highlights that in a pretty looking dashboard, and this is then a way to show the key data, but also the story behind that data. So for a large banking group, what are the key takeaways for this? So in a worst case loss, the calculated impact here is 871 million euros. That is obviously a very large number. Let me try and make this screen a bit bigger so you can see it all at the same time. I can't do that on this window, but never mind. And that is made up from a set of different scenarios here. So in this case, we've modeled business interruption scenario. What happens if there is an outage and the business can't continue? What are the costs associated with that? Each of these scenarios has a slightly different question set behind it as well to steer you in asking the right kind of questions. Data privacy, we've talked about in a bit of detail, and financial theft and fraud here is a third scenario modeled. We compare that with some general business metrics. So in this case, the gross profit. For this particular company, even a catastrophic worst case loss is only going to be 8% here of the gross profit. So in one message to the board around materiality and what does that mean compared to the overall business position, answered here. We've got in the in this dashboard also the features for describing it and adding some commentary. So it's not just a case of it will cost us this amount. Well, actually, where is this coming from? So for the data privacy breach situation, in this particular case, this global banking group has data stores around the world, but actually the German entity and the US entity, all of that data is stored in the same location, triggering multiple regulatory aspects in different regimes. And this then is a way to bring to life the numbers and answer those questions. As we keep going through, you can see how those losses break down, and what we call loss components in the Squalify platform, we have 7 categories here. So largely driving these costs are the data privacy breach costs. These are, as I mentioned, legal fees, costs of notifications to customers, perhaps costs of privacy monitoring, credit monitoring, that kind of thing, if their data has been stolen. And then loss of profit is a big one as well. If the kind of transactional side of the business is down, they're not making money in those cases. We include here various other aspects, so whether it's incident response and forensics costs, each of these have questions which drive out those cost figures. You could also use this to look at risk appetite in a slightly different way. And one of the kind of typical approaches for risk reporting is around thresholds of we're going to allow or tolerate this amount of risk. If it goes above that, then we need to start taking action and notifying the board to that. And actually, we need to get sign-offs for that. This approach is putting real financial figures on it. And so if you have other risk categories across the enterprise risk management system, this is then a way that you can compare cyber risk in a similar way. So moving from I don't know, maybe it's just a gut feeling of this is too much risk to we've got 50 red risks. This is now putting real numbers on it. One of the other outputs from the platform is taking the kind of worst case scenarios and then putting those into slightly more realistic scenarios and going through the particular consequences for your organization brings that in. This then feeds the Monte Carlo simulation, so you can get then quantified realistic scenarios with probabilities attached. And typically what we find in the financial industry is it's kind of very extreme 99th percentile, even above that, the 0.5 there, 99.5 percentile. These are extreme but plausible scenarios, clearly slightly lower numbers there. You can compare with other metrics. I think we've talked about that across. But I think one of the key things that the board wants to know is how do risks change from year to year? And within our model, we anticipate 3 ways that a risk can change from one year to the next. So the green box here on the left, the risk landscape changes. This might be changes in threat actor tactics, techniques, and procedures. This might be new approaches taken in. It might be changes of priority of ransomware actors, those kind of things. The exposure, and this is quite an important one as well, because this is often overlooked. The exposure is the term that we use to capture the business model. So perhaps the company has expanded in the last year. They've taken on they've made an acquisition, taken on new company. They have gone into further territories. That by itself increases the potential risk that the company might face. And through this, we have a way to quantify that. Finally, of course, the information security maturity. Hopefully that is improving year on year. And you'll see these first two items, the risk landscape and exposure, are pushing that risk up from one year to the next. But the investments of the company, the investments of the CISO are bringing that number back down again. But we can see here that even with investments bringing the risk down, the fact that the risk landscape has continually changed, that the company has itself changed, perhaps expanded in the last year, means that the risk is slightly growing. There is a kind of risk inflation, for want of a better term. One of the unique features of our platform is showing that balance between the exposure, perhaps the company's inherent risks, and the maturity. And typically you want those balanced. If you are a large multinational bank, you have a lot of money, you have a lot of data, typically people will try to attack you. You will then have lots of things to defend against. So your exposure will be relatively very high. If you are the local baker who has very little data, very little technology, you probably don't need as high a level of security. And these diagonal lines show that balance. And we use that in a way to talk about benchmarking. So, for example, our banking group here, the three different scenarios that we have are these different circles. So you see at the top, data breach as the highest exposure, and overall kind of mix of those is the next one down. Business interruption, that green one. Ransomware is modeled slightly separately, and then financial theft further down still. You can see here, based on our industry benchmarking data, and this is data that we can receive for risk assessments and security maturity positions here from our parent company, Munich Re. You can see that our banking group customer here is, on average, slightly lower, slightly behind the industry average for each of these items. And this itself is useful for a board to know. They can perhaps realize, hang on, we're behind. The regulators will know the relative positions of things here.
It looks a little bad this morning, and it certainly will get Wall Street's attention and maybe a little bit at the...
Can I ask if you've got a question either at this stage to type it in the chat, or we're coming to the question section very shortly, so you can raise a question shortly. And similarly, depending on the number of peers within an industry group, we can look at how that compares. Very close to this end of this quick demo here. Using this NIST framework, we can quite simply summarize areas for improvement, and this helps then to show which areas to focus on, how to improve, how much needs to be improved. And again, another feature here that a lot of big companies find useful is looking actually, how do all of those metrics compare across the different subsidiary companies within the group? So all the data above that I've showed you is applicable to the kind of overall company, the group, but there are slight differences in either business models, in regulatory environments for different regional subsidiaries. And here we have 3 sub-companies of Germany, France, USA. So this is then a way to govern, steer the risk position across those entities and see from a financial perspective which are the ones which are perhaps the biggest potential losses. And that's a way to also steer your kind of risk investment as well. So that is the world's quickest demo of Squalify. Let me bring you back to the slides and we can get in some time for questions, because I want to make sure we have enough time for everybody to ask questions. Cool. So done the demo. Brilliant. Key takeaways. Let me come back to these after questions. Q&A. So if you have a question, please either raise your hand in Teams, write it in the chat, and then we can get to you.
Yeah,
so let me just answer. Hello?
Mubashir Khan, you do have a
Hi,
question.
hello. Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Douglas and everybody, for really a great presentation. I know I asked a question on Teams regarding regulation fatigue. I mean, I've got loads of questions, but obviously I don't have the time to do that, yeah. But I think what I'm about to say, some of it is a question, some of it is just observation, and I'll let you then comment. So firstly, I think in my experience working with my customers and in my organization, I think we see a lot of what we call kindergarten heat maps, right? And it doesn't help, as you rightly say, because it's very difficult for the board to make a decision on budgets, and it's very difficult for them to sort of visualize, you know, what the impact is of this particular breach. Yeah. So I think, yeah, quantifying risk is definitely the good way to go. I think the challenge that myself and a number of colleagues face is one sticking point, which is the likelihood, right? Because that's mathematical. That's where we're talking Bayesian models, we're talking Monte Carlo. And when people start hearing this stuff, they walk away because it's mathematical, yeah? And they don't want to do maths. A lot of people in cybersecurity are not mathematically oriented, yeah? And that's why I think you have a lot of heat maps going around. Okay, a lot of RAG status going around. And I think what you've demonstrated is good. I'm just wondering, it looks like you're using a FAIR methodology. I'm not sure you are, but we use FAIR in our company, and there are. I just want to know how you measure up against companies like Safe and Risklens and that kind of stuff. I think what you're demonstrating here, I think all the mathematics is hidden right from the user. I think, and
Yeah,
you're just yeah, okay, all right.
You're absolutely right, and thank you for raising that. Heat maps, the thing they got going from them, they're very simple. You don't need to explain it. You don't need to do the maths, and you're right. That is the reason why they have been used for so long, and they still continue to be used. I've used them myself. They're very straightforward. So yes, all the maths within our model is completely not something the user needs to interact with. Our model, we don't use the FAIR methodology, so we have our own proprietary methodology. When I'm saying it's hidden from the user, this means you don't need to write formulas to do these things. It is documented. I will happily geek out with anybody who wants to talk about it and explain the maths underneath it. But our methodology is derived from an insurance pricing methodology from Munich Re, who is our parent company. And this is the pricing methodology they have used to price their cyber insurance policies pretty much for the last 10 years. So they have been using this to assess the risks of companies who want to buy insurance or be reinsured. So they don't have as much data as a FAIR assessment might have access to. But what we have tried to do is pull the most relevant things into this platform, into a set of simple questions that hopefully cybersecurity professionals, operational risk professionals, ERM professionals can understand fairly straightforwardly and find the answers to as well.
What I didn't see, Douglas, what I didn't see here, and forgive me, because I know you've only got an hour, but what I didn't see is, information from threat intelligence and, security incidents. Is that something you factor in?
That comes in two different ways. So this is one of the big differences from us versus FAIR. So FAIR, for example, one half of that assessment tree, for want of a better word, is threat event frequency and understanding how often do these things happen, how capable are the threat actors who might attack me. So that needs a lot of threat intelligence, a lot of historical data to fill it in.
Okay.
What we provide on behalf of our customers is actually a wealth of data from cyber insurance history showing across 10 years, how often do different types of incidents happen? How much do they cost? And so on. So that threat modeling side of things, we greatly simplify. Of course, if there are incidents that highlight weaknesses in controls within an organization, that can be reflected in the control assessment.
Yeah. One last question. No, thank you for that. How do you measure, the intangibles, How do you put a cost on, like, reputational damage, all that kind of stuff?
Reputational damage is a question we get a lot. So, yeah, everybody, it is important. There are different parts of reputational risk, some of which are short-lived and recovered very quickly. So typically reputational risk thinks about impact on the share price. If you look at some companies that have had big public breaches, their share price drops for a week, but within a month, within a year, perhaps it is back close to where they were before. The way we deal with it, we take into account things like loss of revenue, potentially loss of customers. We don't break it out separately. It's kind of baked into those two parts of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, great, Douglas. Thank you so much for that. I'll keep quiet now because I want to give the others an opportunity.
Thank you. And if you have more questions, do contact us afterwards. We will get back to you and happily go through any details that you want.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I saw a question in the chat talking about overlaps between the different frameworks. So I'll start with the last of those. So which one is better and when to use them? I think it's worth being really clear. DORA and NIS are regulations, and so these are things that you need to check. Are you in scope for them? And that depends on what industry you're in. So DORA is financial service focused. NIS is focused on a range of different industries. We've got some information on our blog about both of those to talk through that. ISO 27001 is completely optional. So you can choose to use that if you want to. Yes, there is overlap between all of these, and there are online mappings to show how the different controls are related and how you can answer one with the other. I think the one thing I would say, having gone through this exact thing at a previous company where trying to understand the overlapping regulations between the Swedish FSA, Germany's BaFin, the UK's Financial Conduct Authority, while the topics are always very similar, there are some very specific differences between them. So DORA, for example, talks about third-party risk. It has some very specific requirements that these are the things you must have in a contract. So that's just one example where you need to be aware of what are the specifics relevant to these things. So hopefully that answers it very briefly, but if you, as I say, if you've got any more, come back and ask.
Maybe I can add to that question.
Please do.
So when we, as you mentioned, DORA and NIS2 are regulations. They are not frameworks or standards in a common sense. When we look on DORA, we see that DORA really much relates to ISO 20001. So it's basically built up on it. And when we compare frameworks, you could, for example, compare ISO 20000 with the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a more US-based framework. Many organizations here in the European market, they choose the ISO framework because you can be certified upon ISO, which you cannot be when you choose the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is actually more common in the US. So we see from a structural perspective, for example, when you look on Squalify, NIST framework is sometimes a little bit more intuitive because it has this, and we have shown it on our framework as well, this very logical approach. ISO 20001 is a little bit different structured, more from a, let me say, control aspect. But in general, what is important when it also comes to double regulation, what we typically do is, when we look on regulation, we set up let me say, a information security management system, and we map regulation to actual processes. So we are not building up systems based on regulation, but we do it based on frameworks, and then we map regulation and requirements in regulation to processes. So the goal is always to implement strong processes, and as a side product, you try to implement, you are fulfilling the compliance regulation. So to do that, so it is, and that's what we also shown and said, it's very helpful to use the GRC tool because those tools, they support those kind of tasks.
Thank you, Dennis. We are on 5 o'clock now, or even a little beyond. So thank you for sticking with us. Let me wrap it up. If you have any more questions, please do reach out to us. We will happily answer them offline. So just to wrap up, key learnings. Both DORA and NIS2 really highlight that there is accountability at the top level in companies now to define a risk framework and to make sure that these risks are being monitored. This risk management framework is very useful for steering the cybersecurity program, and it helps you to know what are the worst things that can happen, how do we make sure they are avoided or helped or managed. Quantifying that is a way to help translate the very technical subject into the business language that quite often board directors are not from a technical background, or not from an IT background, but understand risk. And finally, integrating both this risk management process, the governance, the risks, all of those things and how they work together, and quantification can really help you with that part of the compliance for these frameworks. Thank you very much for joining us. If you would like to reach out with any more questions, all of our details here. We will be sending the slides out to everybody afterwards as well. So I'd like to thank Kai and Dennis for joining me today. I'd like to thank all of you on the other end of the screens for joining us as well, and wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks everybody. Bye.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.